You really thought Mom and Dad would leave you the house after everything? You're nothing but a visitor here, Daniel. My brother Mark's voice cut across the funeral gathering like a blade, and the crowd that had gathered in the community hall of St. Luke's Church fell into an uneasy hush before laughter bubbled up from a few cousins who always followed his lead. The kind of laughter that doesn't come from humor but from the thrill of seeing someone humiliated. And I felt every eye turned toward me as though I were a fool who had missed the most obvious truth in the world. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I stood there in my Navy suit, clutching the small walnut box that held my father's war medals, while Mark waved a set of papers like a stage magician revealing his final trick, the amended will that cut me out completely and left everything, house, savings, land, even Dad's old Chevy truck, to him, the sibling who had been gone for years, chasing failed businesses and burning bridges, only to return at the 11th hour when sickness had softened our parents' judgment. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 37 years old and I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. Though for the last 15 years I've lived between Chicago and Dallas working in logistics, grinding my way into a life that finally gave me comfort after too many years of nothing but debt and struggle. And if there's one thing you should know before we go further, it's that I'm not the kind of man who shows all his cards. Because the people who underestimate me always forget that I keep one thing in my back pocket that no one ever sees until it's too late. The air inside the hall smelled of percolated coffee, ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and the faint tan of funeral lily. But beneath it was the rot of betrayal, and while Mark played the grieving son turned triumphant heir, I watched the way aunts and uncles whispered, their eyes darting from me to him, already adjusting their loyalties as though inheritance were currency for affection. My mother had once told me that family was a circle, unbroken no matter what, and she used to give me a tiny brass compass before every long drive back to college, saying, "So you'll always find your way home, Danny." And I kept one of those compasses still in my jacket pocket even now, though home felt less like a circle and more like a knife twisting. The truth is, for years I had sent money when Mom's prescriptions piled up, when Dad's back gave out and the roof leaked, while Mark was unreachable somewhere out west, posting pictures of ski trips and bar tabs, and every holiday dinner ended with my parents sighing, "If only your brother would settle down like you." But blood has a strange pull, and when he came back last winter, gaunt and broke, I watched them soften, watched them cradle him like the prodigal son, while I told myself it didn't matter because what counted was who had actually been there. When the lawyer cleared his throat and confirmed the will's contents, something in me went quiet, not shattered but sharpened, because the public sting of it, the cousins smirking, my childhood friend Kevin shaking his head with pity, my aunt murmuring, "Such a shame," lit something colder than rage in me, a patience I had learned from years of building my life brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, while everyone else seemed to stumble. I didn't speak then. I simply nodded, setting down Dad's medals on the memorial table, and in that silence I knew Mark thought he had finally beaten me, that he had pulled the rug out so thoroughly I'd crawl away humiliated. But as I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the cool brass of that old compass, I promised myself I'd turn this betrayal into something he couldn't see coming, because what Mark never understood is that loyalty can bend into vengeance, and patience, when sharpened, cuts deeper than fury. And so, while the room carried on with plastic smiles and murmured condolences, I lifted my eyes to meet his and gave the faintest smile, one that said I was already planning, already seeing the path, and though he didn't know it yet, his victory had marked the beginning of his fall. The weeks that followed the funeral felt like walking barefoot on broken glass, each step reminding me of what had been taken, yet each cut hardening my resolve. And while Mark paraded through the neighborhood like he had single-handedly built the Carter name, hosting barbecues at the house I had painted and repaired with my own hands, I stayed quiet, moving like a shadow around Dayton, shaking hands with old friends, showing up at the VFW hall where Dad used to play cards, listening to the whispers of who said what, because in a small town information is currency and everyone spends it carelessly when beer loosens their lips. And I was building something Mark couldn't see, something he couldn't fathom because he thought in moments while I thought in maps. He drove Dad's Chevy through town with music blaring, girls in the passenger seat, grinning like the heir he believed himself to be, while I sat in the corner booth of Miller's Diner, off Route 4, nursing black coffee and a slice of pie, overhearing two of my cousins chuckle about how Danny boy finally got what was coming to him. And I let them laugh because the best revenge begins with people convincing themselves you're finished. Mark thought his surface motive was money, the house, the land, the bank accounts, but I began to see the hidden motive as the days unfolded, the way he couldn't resist sneering at me in front of others, the way he leaned too heavily on lines like, "Guess you weren't as close to mom and dad as you thought," as if this were less about inheritance and more about humiliating me, rubbing my loyalty in the dirt to prove to himself that he'd always been the chosen one. I played along with the role he wanted me in, the defeated older brother, stripped of pride by letting him win small skirmishes, each one designed to fatten his arrogance, because arrogance blinds a man more than love or anger ever could. When he strutted into O'Malley's bar and slapped a round of drinks on his tab, announcing, "First rounds on the Carter estate," I raised my glass and toasted him with the crowd, hiding the burn in my chest behind a polite smile. When he threw a party at the house and invited half the neighborhood, even dragging boxes of my old trophies and high school photos into the attic, like clutter unworthy of display, I stopped by only long enough to let him gloat in front of others, his hand squeezing my shoulder too hard as he whispered, "Funny, isn't it? How quickly things change." And I nodded as if he were right. But what he never noticed was the way I studied the house in silence, noting every new crack in the plaster, every unpaid bill left on the kitchen counter, every hasty decision he made with what he thought was newfound wealth, and I began to see the fault lines that would eventually collapse under him, if only I pressed the right way. Then came the first flicker of hope, the kind that could have pulled me into making a premature move, when the lawyer called me privately and admitted that although the will had been amended, several assets were still in limbo: Dad's military pension, certain stocks, the small parcel of land near the river, things Mark hadn't bothered to ask about because he assumed they were insignificant, but in truth they were enough to keep me tethered legally to the estate. For a moment, I felt the surge of victory, imagining how I might use those threads to pull the whole fabric apart, but the moment didn't last. Because the very next day I learned that Mark had found a buyer interested in the land, someone who wanted to bulldoze it into a storage facility, and he had already signed papers to push the sale forward. It was like watching the last tangible piece of my father's legacy being traded for pocket change, and when I confronted him in the driveway, the cool evening air heavy with the smell of cut grass, he smirked and said, "You're lucky I don't send you a bill for the funeral. You think you're owed something, Danny, but you were just a placeholder until I got back." His words hit harder than fists, but I forced my voice into calmness, saying only, "You're making mistakes you don't even see yet," and he laughed, tossing me Dad's old house keys like a man tossing crumbs to a beggar before swaggering inside to his party guests. That night I stood outside the house, the porch light flickering above me, and I felt the brass compass in my pocket like a heartbeat, steadying me, reminding me that revenge was not about reacting, but about steering the path until the other man walked straight into the rocks, without realizing who had drawn the map. The summer heat settled thick over Dayton like a wool blanket, the kind that makes tempers short and mistakes plentiful, and while Mark strutted around the neighborhood in cargo shorts and mirrored sunglasses, hosting poker nights in Dad's old study, I began to pull threads quietly. The kind of threads he couldn't see because he never looked past the surface of things. And every time I passed through town, I felt more like a ghost moving through rooms no one noticed. I started with the paper trail, the unpaid property taxes that had stacked up while our parents were sick, the liens against the house from an old roofing job, the medical bills Mom had left unresolved small debts that Mark, in his arrogance, hadn't even thought to check because he was too busy playing the role of victorious heir. I visited the courthouse, the county clerk, the pension office, gathering details the way a hunter gathers snares, and each piece fell into place in a larger design he couldn't fathom. Meanwhile, he thought he was tightening his grip, calling me out in front of people every chance he got, telling anyone who'd listen that I was still lingering like a stray dog, and I let him believe it, nodding, smiling, even laughing when the moment demanded, because the more convinced he was of my defeat, the less he'd see the trap forming beneath his feet. The ticking clock revealed itself one humid July afternoon when I learned that the land sale by the river was set to finalize in 30 days, a countdown that would erase one of the last ties I had to Dad's legacy, and something about that deadline clarified everything, like the fog lifting from a battlefield, and I realized the time had come to move from patience into precision. I started slipping into the house when Mark was away, The locks unchanged, the halls still smelling faintly of Dad's pipe tobacco and Mom's lavender detergent, and I studied the place the way a thief studies a museum, every picture frame, every drawer, every folder in Dad's old desk. It was in those late-night searches that I found what I hadn't even known I was looking for, a set of old letters tucked inside Dad's copy of For Whom the Bell Tolls, yellowed pages that revealed something our parents had never told either of us, that the land by the river hadn't been theirs to freely give away, but was bound by a trust agreement tied to Dad's military service. A clause that required both heirs to sign off on any sale. My pulse thundered as I read it, the room filling with the hum of cicadas outside the window, because suddenly the power balance shifted, and the secret advantage I had hinted at all along was no longer just a compass in my pocket, but a legal anchor that Mark had no idea existed. I could have revealed it then, could have stormed into his poker night and slammed the letters on the table, watching his face pale as the neighbors realized he wasn't the master of the estate after all, but that would have been too easy, too quick, and revenge, real revenge, demands theater. So I let him continue, let him strut, even as I quietly visited the buyer's lawyer and ensured the papers would stall until both signatures were present. He cursed at the delay, ranting at clerks, berating assistants, convinced incompetence was the culprit, never once suspecting I was the invisible hand on the gears. And then came the moment I had been waiting for, the small win that carried within it the seeds of a larger collapse. Mark invited me to the house one sweltering evening, beer in his hand, sweat staining his shirt, and with the arrogance of a man who thought himself untouchable, he said, "I don't need your permission for anything. I've already got buyers lining up. You'll be out of my hair in no time." I said nothing, only glanced at the compass I set on the counter between us, its needle trembling toward north, and when he laughed, calling it a cheap trinket from Mom, I knew he had forgotten what it meant, forgotten the tradition behind it, and that forgetting would cost him more than he could ever afford. I left the house that night with his laughter ringing behind me, but what he didn't know was that the very papers he was banking on were already slipping through his fingers, and in 30 days' time, the truth would leave him standing on nothing but ashes. The deadline arrived on a storm-heavy August evening, thunder crawling over Dayton like an omen, and Mark swaggered into the county office with his lawyer at his side, grinning as if this was the coronation he'd been waiting for, papers tucked under his arm and a smirk ready for me, because of course I was there too. Sitting quietly in the back row of the clerk's office with the compass in my hand, its brass warmed by my palm, steady as my breathing. The buyer's attorney cleared his throat, laying out the documents, and when he asked for both heirs to sign, Mark's grin faltered for just a fraction of a second, enough for me to see panic flicker like lightning behind his eyes, and I stepped forward, not with anger, but with the calm precision of a man who has waited for this moment, saying, "You don't have both signatures, you never did." The room went still, the rain rattling against the old courthouse windows, and I set down Dad's trust documents, the yellowed letters I had found, proving the land could never be sold without my consent. Mark's lawyer stammered. The buyer cursed under his breath, and for the first time in months, the weight shifted back to me. But I didn't stop there, because revenge, if it is to cut deep, must cut twice. I revealed then what I had quietly been building, how I had acquired the liens, the unpaid debts, the overdue taxes, every scrap of obligation Mark had ignored, and in one motion I handed the clerk notarized papers transferring all those debts into my control, meaning that every dollar he thought he had inherited was now shackled to me. His face drained of color as realization set in, the swagger falling away like a costume, and the bystanders, neighbors, cousins, even old friends watched as the golden air unraveled in front of them. He tried to shout, to argue, claiming manipulation, but the buyer stood up in disgust, tearing the half-signed contract, and the clerk simply said, "Without your brother, nothing moves forward." That was the moment I turned the compass over in my hand and set it on the desk between us, the very symbol Mom had given me to always find my way home, and I said softly, "Home was never yours to steal, Mark. It was built by loyalty, not by signatures on a page." He stared at it, shaking, unable to understand how something so small, so forgotten, could be the weapon that gutted him. The final twist came later when he tried to save face by mortgaging the house for quick cash, only to find the bank rejecting him because the debts I now controlled flagged him as too great a risk. He stormed to my apartment that night, rain soaking his clothes, and screamed through the door that I had ruined him, that I'd always wanted to see him crawl. I opened the door, let him see me standing calm, the compass still in my pocket, and I told him the truth. I never wanted to see you crawl, Mark. I wanted you to stand. But you chose the easy road, and now you've walked it into a cliff. He left broken, and within weeks the house fell into foreclosure proceedings that I quietly arranged to buy through a proxy, restoring it not to my name but to the trust of a veterans fund Dad had once supported. Because poetic justice isn't about hoarding the spoils, it's about making sure the betrayer ends with nothing but the echo of what they lost. Word spread through town, and the same cousins who once laughed now whispered differently, shaking their heads at Mark's fall. And though he tried to spin tales of how I had tricked him, no one believed a man who had tricked everyone else his whole life. The night I moved the last of Dad's medals from the memorial hall to my own shelf, I set the brass compass beside them, its needle still pointing north, and I understood at last why Mom had given it to me all those years. Not just to find my way home, but to remind me that the true path is rarely the easy one, that loyalty, even when betrayed, can be turned into a weapon sharper than hate. I didn't just win back what was stolen, I won back my own peace, and I left Mark with nothing but his own reflection, the cruelest inheritance of all. And as I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, the storm finally breaking into clear skies, I felt the strange calm of justice fulfilled, knowing that in the end, the compass had led me exactly where I was always meant to be. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.